Good afternoon and welcome to 1 p.m. Weekly News, where we bring you the latest news and stories on climate change, sustainability, and a rapidly changing world. I'm your host, Shelby. Let's get into it. The Guardian reports that the European Union has updated environmental legislation to criminalize wide-scale environmental damage in, quote, cases comparable to ecocide. The law now covers the destruction to ecosystems, habitat loss, and long-lasting damage to air, soil, or water. More specific examples include the unauthorized extraction of water from natural resources such as lakes and aquifers, the introduction of invasive species, and large-scale deforestation. Notably missing from the legislation is the export of toxic waste to developing countries and abuses associated with the fishing industry. The new law is expected to be passed in the spring of 2024, which will then give EU member countries 2 years to incorporate the legislation into their own national laws. The German car manufacturer BMW is officially ending its production of combustion engines in Germany. Announced 3 years ago, in 2020, BMW is making more room for the production of electric cars at its Bavarian plant and moving what remains of its fossil fuel burning engine production to Austria and the UK. Considered to be a global pioneer in the transition of its energy systems towards renewable energy, 40% of Germany's current energy consumption is from renewable energy sources. Also, given that the EU is planning to ban the sale of new combustion engine cars by 2035, the discontinuation of gas-powered engines soon could be a sign of things to come from other German global car brands, such as Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, Mercedes-Benz, and Opel, among others. A large oil spill was discovered 2 weeks ago off the Louisiana coast in the Gulf of Mexico. The contamination is estimated by the U.S. Coast Guard to be 1.1 million gallons of oil. The source of the spill is still under review, but the commanding officer for the Coast Guard's New Orleans sector, Captain Kelly Denning, has said that a nearby 67-mile pipeline called the Main Pass is suspected. Other incidents in the Gulf of Mexico in the past 20 years include the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig in 2010 that spilled 130 million gallons of crude oil, and the Taylor Energy spill in 2004 that saw 30 million gallons of crude oil leaked. Kristen Monsell of the Center for Biological Diversity's Oceans Program said in a statement about the recent oil spill, quote, "Ocean wildlife will almost certainly pay a terrible price for this huge pipeline spill, which is less an accident than an entirely predictable consequence of offshore oil operations." The Global Climate Conference, COP28, began last Thursday, November 30th, in Dubai and runs through December 12th. The name COP stands for Conference of the Parties and represents the 200 countries that originally agreed to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. This annual conference rotates each year through 5 regions that include Africa, Asia Pacific, Eastern Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Western Europe. Scheduled agenda items this year include a new fund to compensate poor countries for, quote, loss and damage, an assessment called the Global Stocktake, which will determine whether the world is on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and whether or not fossil fuels will be phased out in the final COP28 deal. Major oil-producing countries like the United Arab Emirates, who are also hosting the conference, are expected to resist language about fossil fuel phase-outs. The FDA introduced a new law in 2022 that adds regulations to the cosmetics industry. The legislation is called the Modernization of Cosmetics Regulation Act, or MOCRA, and it is the first meaningful update since 1938, when the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was introduced. Even with expanded regulatory powers, MOCRA lacks the authority to require cosmetic companies to prove their products are safe before they go to market. The European Union has outlawed the use of 2,400 chemicals in cosmetics, while the US has banned only 11 substances. An advocacy group called the Campaign for Safe Cosmetics tested 32 products in 2018 and found a number of harmful chemicals that were linked to cancer, asthma, and other health conditions. Startups in the cultivated meat sector are scaling production facilities throughout the world to produce cell-cultured alternatives to conventional meat products. Examples include a company called Meatable, a Dutch cultivated pork producer that raised $35 million in a Series B round this past August, bringing the total investment in the company to $95 million. In South Africa, New Form Foods has already introduced its cultivated beef burger and lamb meatballs and looks to create cell-cultured sausage, steak, and chicken, among other meats in the future. And the first cultured lamb producer in Australia, Magic Valley, introduced lamb last year and cultivated pork earlier in 2023. The company claims that its cultivated meat products reduce emissions by 92%, land use by 95%, and water use by 78%, in comparison to conventional meat products that also require the farming and slaughter of animals. And finally, the federal U.S. government announced last Tuesday that wolverines are now listed under the Endangered Species Act. It's estimated that only 300 wolverines remain in the lower 48 states. They exist primarily in the northern Rocky Mountains and the northern Cascades of the western U.S. According to new research, federal officials say that the wolverine population must maintain its connection to southern Canada to remain viable, but roads and highways are preventing females from migrating into the U.S. By the year 1920, most of the wolverines in the West had died because of poisoning, trapping, and starvation, though the numbers have grown since that time. The Trump administration ruled that the wolverine population should not be protected, but a judge vacated that decision last year and required that the Fish and Wildlife Service reconsider its decision. The fossil fuel industry, farm bureaus, and snowmobile associations have also opposed protections for wolverines. Those are the latest top-line environmental stories. Please join us again next week for a new episode of 1 p.m. Weekly News.